Remember when one of the most disturbing horror films ever made was created almost by accident, by a young director who didn't particularly want to make it, financed by a company that sold softcore pornography, starring an actress fresh off a candy-colored French musical, shot for the price of a modest London house, by a filmmaker who later dismissed it as the shoddiest thing he'd ever done. The producers thought they were buying a piece of cheap exploitation sleaze. What they got instead became a landmark of world cinema and made its director internationally famous overnight. He'd only made it to get the money for a different film entirely, one almost nobody remembers today. Directed by Roman Polanski, co-written with Gerard Braque, and produced by Jean Gutowski, starring Catherine Deneuve as Carol, a beautiful, withdrawn young woman whose grip on reality dissolves when she's left alone in a London apartment. Repulsion was Polanski's first English-language film and the opening chapter of what would become his Apartment trilogy, followed by Rosemary's Baby and The Tenant. It won a major prize at the Berlin Film Festival, drew comparisons to Hitchcock, and remains one of the most unbearably claustrophobic descents into madness ever committed to film. Today, we're counting down 15 weird facts about Repulsion. And stick around for number one, because the entire reason this masterpiece exists has nothing to do with art, horror, or ambition, and everything to do with a completely different movie that the world has almost entirely forgotten. Hit that like button, subscribe, and drop a comment. Is Repulsion scarier than Rosemary's Baby, or does the later film win? Make the case below. Alright, mind the cracks in the walls. Let's get into it. The money behind one of the most critically revered psychological horror films in cinema history came from a deeply unglamorous source. Paramount Pictures turned the project down. British Lion Films turned it down. Polanski and his producer Jean Gutowski, unable to secure backing from any respectable studio, eventually struck a deal with Compton Films, a company whose primary business was the distribution of softcore pornography. Compton was looking to climb out of the sleaze trade and move into something more respectable, and they wanted a horror film that could combine sex and art into a commercial package. Repulsion, on paper, looked like exactly that. A film about a sexually disturbed young woman, full of psychosexual imagery, marketable to the exploitation crowd. What Compton actually received was something entirely different from what they had ordered. The producers had expected a piece of titillating genre product they could sell on its lurid premise. Instead, Polanski delivered a genuinely disturbing, artistically serious examination of mental disintegration that critics would hail as a masterpiece. The Compton executive Tony Tenser reportedly summed up the surprise with a perfect line. It was like ordering a Mini Cooper and winding up with a Rolls. The men who sold softcore films had accidentally financed one of the defining works of art house horror. They had been hoping for sleaze. They got a classic and they couldn't quite believe their luck. Here is the fact that reframes the entire production, and it's worth sitting with. Roman Polanski did not make Repulsion because he was burning to make Repulsion. He made it because he needed money to make something else. He and his writing partner, Gerard Braque, had a dream project, a strange, difficult, pointedly uncommercial black comedy called Cul de Sac that no one would finance because it was exactly the kind of personal, idiosyncratic film that studios run from. So Polanski and Braque made a calculated decision. They would write something commercial, something with obvious genre appeal, something that could be sold as exploitation horror and would generate enough money and industry goodwill to get their real passion project off the ground. Repulsion was, in the language of the industry, one for them. A job, a means to an end, a potboiler. Polanski himself described it in exactly those terms. He conceived it as a commercial throwaway designed to finance the work he actually cared about. And the bitter irony, the thing that makes this fact genuinely strange, is how completely history reversed the two films' fortunes. Repulsion became a landmark of world cinema, studied and revered for 60 years. Cul de Sac, the film Polanski actually wanted to make, the one Repulsion existed to fund, won the Golden Bear at Berlin and then drifted into relative obscurity, remembered today mostly by Polanski completists. The throwaway became the masterpiece. The masterpiece became the throwaway. Most directors, looking back on a film that established their international reputation and is now regarded as a classic, would find something kind to say about it. Roman Polanski did the opposite. Decades after Repulsion, with its reputation as a masterpiece firmly established, Polanski went on record describing it as the shoddiest film he had ever made, technically well below the standard he tried to achieve in his work. He didn't mean it as false modesty or self-deprecating charm. He meant it as a genuine technical assessment from a director who had become a perfectionist and who looked back at this early, hurried, under-resourced production and saw the seams. And on the narrow technical points, he wasn't entirely wrong. Repulsion was made fast, made cheap, and made under significant constraints by a director still learning to work in English and in a foreign film industry. There are rough edges, there are compromises forced by the tiny budget, but film history has rendered its own verdict and it disagrees with Polanski completely. The shoddiness he perceived, the rawness, the unpolished quality, the sense of a filmmaker working at the edge of his resources is, to almost everyone else, part of what makes the film so disturbing. A glossier, more technically refined Repulsion would almost certainly be a worse film. The constraints Polanski apologized for are the constraints that made it great. Catherine Deneuve was, by 1964, one of the most beautiful women in international cinema. Luminous, flawless, the kind of face that cameras were built to flatter. Polanski's instructions to his cinematographer, Gilbert Taylor, ran in the exact opposite direction. He wanted Deneuve to look bad. Specifically, he wanted her shot in extreme close-ups using a wide-angle lens that distorted her features, pushing in so close that the audience could see the veins in her eyes, the pores and lines in her skin, the dark roots beneath her hair, every detail magnified to the point of grotesquerie. The beauty was to be deliberately undermined, made uncomfortable, turned into something the viewer instinctively wanted to pull away from. Gilbert Taylor could not understand it. He was a professional cinematographer whose entire training pointed toward making beautiful women look as beautiful as possible, and here was a young director insisting he do the reverse to one of the most gorgeous actresses alive. Taylor reportedly muttered on set that he hated doing this to a beautiful woman, but the discomfort was the entire point. The film is called Repulsion, and Polanski understood that part of its power came from making the audience feel repelled by the very thing they were drawn to look at. The distortion of Deneuve's beauty mirrors the distortion of Carol's mind. Taylor hated creating the effect. The effect is one of the reasons the film works. The casting of Catherine Deneuve as Carol is one of the great tonal jokes in the history of horror casting. Immediately before playing a withdrawn, sexually terrified young woman who hallucinates rape and murders two men in a decaying apartment, Deneuve had starred in The Umbrellas of Cherbourg, Jacques Demy's gorgeous, melancholy, entirely sung through French musical, a film of pastel colors and aching romantic melody, one of the most delicate and beautiful works in all of French cinema. She went from the candy-colored dreamscape of Cherbourg directly into the gray, cracking, nightmarish horror of Repulsion. Few actresses have ever made a more violent tonal swing between two consecutive films. What's more, Deneuve was only 21 years old and had already appeared in over a dozen films by the time she made Repulsion, and by several accounts, she was not the passive, fearful presence on set that her character might suggest. She delighted in sparring with Polanski, asserting her own views about how scenes should be played, holding her own against a director famous for his control. The blank, withdrawn, almost catatonic Carol that appears on screen, a performance of profound interiority and stillness, was created by a young, confident, opinionated actress who had just stepped out of a singing romance and was perfectly happy to argue with her director about the work. The fragility is entirely an illusion. That's what makes it acting. One of the most genuinely nightmarish images in the entire film, and one of the most imitated in horror cinema since, is the sequence in which Carol walks down the shadowed corridor of her apartment and dozens of men's hands burst from the walls to grope and grab at her body. It is a pure expression of her psychosexual terror made physical, the architecture of her home transforming into the architecture of her nightmare, and it was achieved with remarkably simple, tactile, pre-digital craft. The walls were constructed of a pliable material into which performers' arms could be inserted, and the surfaces were built so that they could appear to be soft, yielding clay. At one point, the walls of the apartment literally turned to that texture, covered in handprints as if the whole space had become malleable under the pressure of Carol's disintegrating mind. This was 1965. There were no digital effects, no compositing, no way to add the hands in post-production. Everything you see was built physically on a set and performed in real time in front of the camera. The corridor of grasping hands draws directly on a lineage of earlier surrealist cinema. The magical, reaching corridors of Jean Cocteau's Beauty and the Beast are a clear ancestor, but Polanski pushed the technique into something far more violating and horrific than his influences. The effect remains genuinely upsetting 60 years later precisely because it is real. Those are real arms, in a real wall, reaching for a real actress. Nothing about it is faked, and the body knows it. Alongside the grabbing hands, the other signature visual of Repulsion is the cracking of the apartment walls. Great fissures that split open across the plaster as Carol's mind fractures, the building physically breaking apart in sync with her psyche. It is one of the most celebrated practical effects in the history of horror cinema, and it operates on a brilliantly simple symbolic logic. Early in the film, Carol notices a small crack in the apartment wall and remarks, almost absently, that she must get it mended. The crack is never mended. Instead, it grows and spreads, and eventually the walls tear themselves apart in a nightmare sequence, the architecture of her home rupturing exactly as her sanity does. Polanski built an entire subliminal visual language around this idea of the apartment as an extension of Carol's mind. The cracks in the walls echo cracks that appear in the pavement outside. The decay of the apartment, the filth, the disrepair, the rotting food, tracks precisely with her mental deterioration. This is the central organizing principle of what would become his apartment trilogy. The idea that architecture itself can harbor, express, and reflect horror, that the spaces people live in can become instruments of their psychological torment. Repulsion is the most literal version of this idea, because here the apartment doesn't contain a supernatural evil like the later films. It simply is Carol's mind, made of plaster, cracking open in real time. If those grabbing hands have lived rent-free in your nightmares since the first time you saw this film, hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment. Which image disturbed you more, the hands in the corridor or the walls cracking apart? Settle it below. Alright, back to the apartment. Among all the elaborate hallucinations and surreal effects, one of Repulsion's most genuinely disturbing elements is something completely mundane: a skinned rabbit. Early in the film, Carol takes a raw, skinned rabbit out of the refrigerator, intending to cook it, and then, distracted by her unraveling mind, sets it down in the living room and simply leaves it there. Over the course of the film, as Carol descends further into madness and the apartment decays around her, the rabbit sits out, rotting, slowly putrefying in the open air of the living room, a constant background presence of corruption and decay that nobody attends to. The rotting rabbit works on the audience in a way the grander effects don't, precisely because it's so ordinary and so wrong. Eventually, the severed head of the rabbit turns up in Carol's handbag, discovered by a horrified co-worker, a small, grotesque detail that signals just how far gone she is. The slow decay of the rabbit becomes a kind of clock, marking the passage of time and the depth of Carol's deterioration without a single line of dialogue. Polanski understood that a decomposing piece of meat left where food should never be left communicates a disintegrating mind more powerfully than any amount of overt horror. The rabbit just sits there and rots, and the audience can almost smell it. Roman Polanski had a habit throughout his career of making small cameo appearances in his own films, and Repulsion contains one of his more obscure ones. In a brief street scene, a trio of buskers performs, and among them is a spoon player, a man clacking a pair of spoons together in the rhythmic percussion style of traditional street musicians. That spoon player is Polanski himself, the director of the film. The man orchestrating Carol's entire descent into madness appears within his own creation for a few seconds as an anonymous street musician, part of the indifferent London bustle that surrounds and ignores his disintegrating protagonist. The cameo is easy to miss and means nothing to the plot, but it fits a pattern in Polanski's work and in the broader tradition of directors inserting themselves into their films, Hitchcock style. What makes it quietly resonant in Repulsion specifically is the contrast it embodies. The film is one of the most claustrophobic, interior, subjective experiences in cinema, locked almost entirely inside one woman's fracturing perception. And yet, here is its author, briefly visible, out on the street, playing the spoons, part of the ordinary world that carries on completely oblivious to the horror unfolding behind one apartment window. Carol is drowning. The city plays the spoons. For a film of such intense psychological impact, Repulsion is remarkable for how little it actually says. Dialogue is nearly eliminated from the film. There are only a handful of spoken exchanges, and most of them are deliberately banal and offhand. Small talk, trivial pleasantries, the meaningless chatter of peripheral characters whose Englishness Polanski plays almost as comedy. Carol herself barely speaks. The film commits, with total discipline, to staying inside her silent, deteriorating perspective, and silence becomes one of its most powerful tools. The famous rape hallucination sequences play out in near total silence, broken only by the relentless, amplified ticking of a clock, a sound that becomes unbearable precisely because there is nothing else to listen to. This near wordlessness is a radical choice, especially for a commercial film meant to be sold to exploitation audiences. Polanski stripped away the explanatory dialogue that a conventional psychological thriller would use to tell you what's happening and why. There is no scene where a doctor explains Carol's condition, no Freudian monologue, no tidy diagnosis. The film refuses to translate her experience into words because words would create distance, and Polanski wanted no distance at all. He wanted the audience trapped inside a silent, breaking mind, with only amplified sound effects, the ticking clock, the dripping tap, the doorbell, the the breathing, to mark the boundaries of a world that has stopped making sense. The silence is the horror. This is the kind of detail that most viewers never consciously notice, but that works on them anyway, which is exactly how Polanski intended it. Throughout Repulsion, the doorbell of Carol's apartment and the telephone produced nearly the same sound, an oral confusion deliberately engineered into the film's sound design. In a film built around a character who can no longer reliably distinguish reality from hallucination, the decision to make two different signals from the outside world sound identical is a quiet masterstroke. Every time one of them rings, there is a flicker of uncertainty. Is that the door or the phone? Is that the outside world trying to reach her, or is it inside her head? Polanski layered the entire film with these kinds of recurring sonic and visual motifs, a subliminal architecture of repeated images and sounds that builds meaning beneath the surface of the minimal plot. Eyes, razors, cracks, sprouting potatoes, slowly germinating in the kitchen as another marker of neglected time. The corpse of the rabbit, the ticking clock, the dripping faucet, the tolling of a nearby bell, the laughter drifting up from the courtyard of a convent below. These elements recur and echo throughout the film, creating a subliminal narrative that is, in many ways, more important than the events of the plot. The identical doorbell and telephone is one small piece of that design, a deliberate erosion of the audience's certainty hidden in plain hearing. Repulsion is bookended by two images that tell you, if you're paying attention, exactly what kind of film you are watching. It opens with an extreme close-up of an eye, Carol's eye, filling the entire screen, so close that it becomes abstract and unsettling before the film has shown you anything else. And it ends, after everything that follows, with a slow push into an old family photograph, finally settling on the image of Carol as a child, where her expression, and specifically her gaze, provides the film's only cryptic suggestion of where all of this came from. The framing is deliberate and meaningful. By opening on the eye, Polanski announces immediately that this is a film about subjective perception, about seeing, that the audience is going to spend the next 100 minutes looking out through the eyes of a person whose vision of reality cannot be trusted. The entire film is constructed to make no clear distinction between what is real and what Carol is hallucinating. We are locked inside her perspective with no external anchor. And by closing on the childhood photograph, the film offers its single, withholding gesture toward explanation, a suggestion that whatever broke Carol was already visible in her eyes as a little girl, long before the events of the film. It explains almost nothing. It explains just enough. The eye opens the film and the eye closes it, and everything between belongs to a mind we can see out of but never fully understand. Repulsion did not announce itself as the first part of a trilogy. Polanski had no master plan in 1965 to make 3 films about the horror of urban dwelling. But in retrospect, the film became the opening chapter of what critics and audiences now call his apartment trilogy, 3 films, made across 11 years, each built around the idea that the place a person lives can become the instrument and reflection of their psychological destruction. Repulsion came first. Rosemary's Baby followed in 1968, transplanting the formula to a New York apartment building and adding a supernatural satanic conspiracy. The Tenant completed it in 1976, with Polanski himself starring as a man who comes to believe his Paris apartment building is conspiring to drive him to suicide. The 3 films share a remarkable amount of DNA, and watching Repulsion now, you can see the seeds of everything that followed. The peephole shots, the voices and sounds bleeding through walls, the raw meat, the hallucinations of sexual violation, the slow accumulating sense of paranoia, of the familiar turning strange and hostile. Repulsion is in many ways the raw, unpolished, stripped-down prototype for Rosemary's Baby. The same anxieties and techniques, but without the supernatural machinery, without the Hollywood gloss, without the explanation. Where the later films give you cults and demons to blame, Repulsion gives you only a breaking mind and a decaying apartment. It is the purest and most frightening of the 3, precisely because it offers nothing external to hold responsible. Before Repulsion, Roman Polanski was a promising young filmmaker with one acclaimed feature to his name, Knife in the Water, made in his native Poland, which had earned an Academy Award nomination but had not made him a household name in the West. He was working in London, recently arrived, his first marriage broken up, taking on a commercial horror project mainly to fund a different film. After Repulsion, he was internationally famous. The film won a major prize at the Berlin Film Festival, the Silver Bear, and critics greeted it as the arrival of a major talent, some going so far as to hail Polanski as a new Hitchcock. The cheap exploitation potboiler had turned its director into one of the most talked about filmmakers in the world. The trajectory this set in motion is staggering in retrospect. Repulsion established Polanski's international reputation, which led directly to the opportunities that followed. Cul-de-sac, then his Hollywood breakthrough with Rosemary's Baby in 1968, then Chinatown in 1974, one of the most acclaimed films ever made. The entire arc of one of cinema's most significant and most controversial directorial careers can be traced back to a film he made almost reluctantly on a tiny budget for a soft-core pornography company to fund a project he cared about more. Repulsion was supposed to be the stepping stone. It turned out to be the foundation. Everything Polanski became, for better and for very much worse, started here. This is the fact that contains all the others, the central irony from which the entire strange story of Repulsion unfolds. Roman Polanski made one of the most revered psychological horror films in the history of cinema, a film studied in universities, preserved by the Criterion Collection, cited as a landmark of the genre, watched and rewatched and dissected for 60 years. For one reason, to get the money to make Cul-de-sac. Cul-de-sac was the film he and Gerard Brock genuinely cared about. The personal, difficult, idiosyncratic black comedy that was the actual goal. Repulsion was the commercial sacrifice, the compromise, the thing made to please other people so that the real work could happen. And here's how it all turned out. Cul-de-sac did get made in 1966, and it even won the Golden Bear, the top prize at the Berlin Film Festival. By any reasonable measure, the plan worked perfectly. The throwaway funded the Passion Project, and the Passion Project was acclaimed. But ask anyone outside a film studies department to name a Roman Polanski film, and they will say Rosemary's Baby, or Chinatown, or Repulsion. Almost no one will say Cul-de-sac. The film that Repulsion was created to enable has been almost entirely forgotten by the wider world. While Repulsion itself, the means, the stepping stone, the commercial obligation, the film Polanski called the shoddiest he ever made, endures as a masterpiece. Polanski set out to make a disposable film to fund an important one. History looked at his work and decided he had gotten it exactly backwards. So there you have it. 15 facts about a film financed by a porn company that wanted sleaze and got a classic. Shot to make a beautiful actress look repulsive. Built around grabbing hands and cracking walls made entirely by hand. Almost completely silent. Directed by a man who called it his worst work and only made it to fund a movie the world has since forgotten. Catherine Deneuve walked from a candy-colored musical straight into a decaying nightmare and made it look effortless. Polanski put himself in the corner of the frame playing the spoons. And the whole thing launched one of cinema's most brilliant and most troubling careers. The throwaway became the masterpiece. The masterpiece became the throwaway. Like, subscribe, and share this with whoever first showed you Repulsion and didn't warn you about the corridor. They knew. They always know. Until next time, get that crack in the wall mended before it's too late.